Hey, 42 here. It was a simmering morning on the banks of the Red River in Logan, Kentucky, and the future 7th President of the United States of America, Andrew Jackson, was frozen in place. Sweat pouring down his brow and blood pouring from his chest. He had just been shot with a lead ball from Charles Dickinson's pistol, a renowned duelist and one of the best marksmen in all of Tennessee. The two had come to blows over a horse racing dispute and had decided to duel the matter out. Jackson's hand clung onto his heart, with crimson blood seeping into the fabric of his coat with each shallow breath. For a moment, onlookers braced themselves for his inevitable collapse. But that moment never came. Instead, Jackson calmly pulled out his handkerchief, wiped the blood from his chest, then raised his pistol and returned fire at Charles Dickinson. He placed one shot precisely in his heart, killing him. You see, Dickinson's reputation as a marksman was well known, and so Jackson knew he couldn't outdraw him in a fair fight. So, upon arriving at the duel, Jackson commanded Dickinson to take the first shot, something that nobody ever did in a duel. But Jackson had donned an oversized coat to slightly obscure the location of his vital organs. If he could survive that first shot, then he'd have the opportunity to take a free shot at his opponent and potentially win. The shot that Jackson took prior to killing his opponent just missed his heart, but he never removed that iron ball. It stayed inside him as a medal of honor until the day he died. So I've been using Magic Mind shots for 6 months now. I find that they sharpen my focus and allow me to get so much more work done on a daily basis. I genuinely love these shots, but truth be told, they're a little bulky to travel with. I recently went away for 14 days, and Magic Mind is so beneficial for my mental performance that I actually packed 14 of these shots in my suitcase. So I'm really excited to announce that Magic Mind gummies have just launched. And one pouch of these bad boys contains 90 focus boosting gummies, so they're so much more convenient to travel with and take on the go. Gummies are basically Magic Mind shots with all the same ingredients except for the caffeine, which makes them a great choice when you need to lock in for a late night work session. They're also great for everyone in the family. They're safe for children from 8 years old, and they have this kicking green apple flavor which is slightly tangy and sweet. I absolutely love it. Magic Mind backs up its ingredients and formulations with over 200 peer-reviewed studies. Packed with super nootropics such as Bacopa monnieri and lion's mane mushrooms, which are organically grown in California. So use the link in my description or the QR code on screen now to head over to Magic Mind and get 25% off your gummies today. And thanks to Magic Mind for sponsoring this video. Jackson vs. Dickinson is probably the most famous duel in history, but the code that compels these two men to risk their lives was not unique to early 19th century Tennessee. Dueling had, in fact, shaped reputations and settled scores for centuries, from medieval knights in clashing armor to noblemen with rapiers at dawn, and even pistol-wielding gentlemen across Europe and the Americas. The origins of the duel can be traced back to the medieval practice of trial by combat, where disputes were settled not by reasoned argument or evidence, but by fisticuffs and the odd bit of stabby-stabby. It was a rather straightforward philosophy. Whoever survived was presumed to have God on his side, because surely the Almighty wouldn't let an innocent man die, right? As crazy as that seemed, and it was crazy, it laid the groundwork for a system of honor and justice that would endure for centuries. In medieval Germany, combatants would settle disputes by stepping into a literal pit of sand, armed with nothing but clubs or blunt-ended swords. And if one fighter was deemed physically stronger than the other, the stronger man had to fight from a kneeling position. In contrast, the French, never one to pass up an opportunity for drama, had a tradition where combatants would ceremoniously throw down a gauntlet onto the floor, such as a glove. If you picked it up, congratulations, you just signed up for a duel. If you didn't, you were branded a coward, which was extremely damning since one's status meant everything to him in medieval France. Not much has changed, really. In Britain, we made things weird. In cases of trial by combat where a man and a woman faced off, the man would often be required to stand waist deep in a hole armed with a club, whilst a woman was free to move around above ground wielding a sack full of rocks. The logic being that it leveled the playing field, and it looked really funny. Of course, for those less keen on getting their hands dirty, there was always the option of hiring a champion to fight on your behalf. A champion was basically a freelancer who was quite happy to fight to the death for someone he usually didn't even know. The practice of hiring champions was most popular in parts of Italy. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the art of dueling had reached peak absurdity, especially in France. You see, the French had decided that dueling was no longer about silly things like honor or justice. No, it was now all about looking as fabulous as possible whilst waggling a stick about in your opponent's face. The rapier was the weapon of choice, and noblemen loved nothing more than to get into a rapier waggle-off over the smallest of slights. Perhaps someone had insulted one's poetry, or thrown shade at the limpness of one's feather hat. Dueling etiquette became so intricate that entire books were written on the subject, such as the 1575 Italian fencing manual Lo Schermo, which advised duelists on foot positioning, blade angles, and most importantly, to any French readers, how to look sufficiently dramatic whilst doing it. The French even developed a term, l'effet du honneur, meaning that any perceived insult, no matter how small, could and should be resolved with steel. The most infamous French duel was the Duel des Mignons in 1578, where 6 high-ranking courtiers of King Henry III and the Duke of Guise fought in a brutal and bloody melee. It all began over a trivial insult concerning a lady's virtue or something like that. In the cutthroat milieu of the French court, such a slight was tantamount to a declaration of war. So before the first cock crowed, 6 of Henry III's most ostentatious courtiers had gathered at the Louvre's horse market. And when I say ostentatious courtiers, there were more feather caps and ruffled sleeves than at a village pantomime. The battle was swift, brutal, and most importantly, horrendously theatrical. As the rapiers flashed in the early morning light, 4 men lay dead, and another 2 were gravely wounded. The blood-soaked survivors limped away. But it gets even sillier. In 1808, 2 gentlemen, Monsieur de Grandpré and Monsieur Lepic, found themselves in a heated dispute over the affections of a Parisian ballerina. But rather than settle their grievances in the tried and tested manner of rapiers at dawn or pistols in a foggy park, these 2 decided that the only fitting venue for their clash was 2,700 feet above Paris. Each man climbed into his own hot air balloon, accompanied by a second and armed with a blunderbuss. Well, this is going to end really well, isn't it? As they ascended above the Tuileries gardens, Lepic fired first, but his shot went wide. Grandpré, on the other hand, took careful aim and struck Lepic's balloon, sending it plummeting to the earth. Grandpré, now both victorious and significantly higher in altitude than when he started, drifted safely down to land, miles away. Across the channel, meanwhile, the English gentry were also busy dreaming up inventive ways to settle their minor disputes by brutally murdering each other. Whereas the French were theatrical about their duels, the English approach was more, shall we say, practical. They preferred pistols over swords. But how deadly were these pistol duels exactly? Well, between 1785 and 1845, about 1,000 duels were recorded in Britain, with a death rate of 20%. We don't have any concrete stats on the death rate from fencing duels, since their popularity was way back during the Renaissance, but when you consider that the participants were often extremely well trained, it's possible that they were even deadlier than pistols. This proliferation of pistol-based duels in Britain had an unintentional side effect. Using firearms removed much of the skill and training required to enter into a duel. All one needed was a steady hand and a good aim. Actually, you didn't even need that. One lucky shot would be sufficient to seal a deal. For most duels, smooth-bore flintlock pistols were the weapon of choice. These were single-shot firearms, meaning if you missed, or if your one shot failed to mortally wound or incapacitate your foe, then you had to reload. Depending on the dexterity of the duelist, this process typically took around 20 to 30 seconds. And this time, you better bloody hope that your shot hits its mark. To reload one of these bad boys, you would have to retrieve your powder, measure it out, and precisely pour it down the barrel, insert a new lead ball, stuff a piece of cloth or paper into the barrel, then, using a ramrod, ram the ball firmly into place. Prime the pan by adding a small amount of gunpowder to the flash pan, cock the flintlock, then, finally, aim and fire. And this meant that there wasn't a whole lot of skill behind a pistol duel, and most were won with a lucky shot. So any Larry, Tom, Dick or Harry could pick up a pistol and challenge any Bob, John or Pete to a duel and have about a 50% chance of winning. Now just contrast this to a rapier duel with its intricate footwork, parries and thrusts, where years of practice and training were required to stand a chance. A rapier duel was an art form, an elegant chance of death, a carefully choreographed display of skill and discipline. The aristocracy all across Europe received training in fencing from a young age, whereas the working and middle classes did not. Pistol duel, by contrast, was just two blokes taking turns trying not to get shot in the face, and was therefore much more befitting to the lower classes. This had a really interesting effect in that pistols sort of democratized dueling. Now, any old Will, Wayne or Scott could settle his dispute out of a court of law in a much more succinct and often final way. By the 18th and 19th centuries, dueling had evolved from a nobleman's prerogative to a widely accepted, albeit highly illegal, method of dispute resolution. Yes, you heard that right. Dueling was strictly outlawed across most of Europe, despite the fact that everyone was at it. Occasionally, duelists were arrested and charged with murder or manslaughter. Most of the time, the case was dismissed and the participants were instead asked to leave the town. Obviously, duelists from households of higher stature with more influence in the local town could avoid post-dueling charges altogether. The funny thing about receiving a challenge to a duel was that it was actually a compliment. If someone challenged you, then he considered you to be an equal and a gentleman. A duel was a way of saying, I respect you and your station, so let's battle this out in the gentlemanly manner. Each man would have to bring a second with him, usually a close friend who would arbiter the duel. Each man's second would confer beforehand to set out the rules. How many paces apart would the duel take place? 10? 20? They would agree on the format too. They could choose between the French method, where each man took X number of paces back to back before turning to fire when one of the seconds shouted a signal, and only on the signal, not before. Or there was the British method, in which participants started face to face, but would only be allowed to fire their first and subsequent shots when one of the seconds counted down, like 3, 2, 1, fire. Typically, the maximum number of shots allowed would be agreed upon in advance, but it was almost never more than 3. If you failed to win the duel with 3 bullets, then to continue shooting at your opponent was considered downright barbaric. The seconds would load the pistols in front of the others to ensure each pistol was the same and loaded with the same ammo. Seconds would also inspect the ground to ensure neither party had an unfair advantage by being on a slightly higher patch of earth, and they would arrange for a doctor or surgeon to be present to perform emergency stitch-ups if needed. Seconds were also responsible for pre-arranging the dress code for everyone present. Duels were a formal affair, after all, but perhaps the most important role of the seconds was to provide refreshments. Typically, they would pack champagne that could be enjoyed by all after the duel, whether or not one of the participants had died. Occasionally, a duelist would attempt to delope. That meant to throw away his first shot by shooting it into the ground or intentionally shooting wide of their opponent. Over in the US, during Alexander Hamilton's infamous duel with Vice President Arran Burr in 1804, Hamilton deloped by shooting over the head of Burr, but Burr shot back regardless and mortally wounded him. Deloping was frowned upon as it was cowardly, but to shoot back after someone already deloped is even worse. Over in Ireland, they actually took an old set of Roman dueling laws and expanded upon them to create a new set of bylaws called the Irish Code Duelo that described in 25 detailed rules how a duel should take place. And in that, they explicitly outlawed the practice of deloping. Interestingly, this wasn't because it was considered cowardly, but because deloping often resulted in accidental injuries. Perhaps the strangest iteration of dueling culture took place in pre-war Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. A bizarre form of academic fencing took over the German middle and upper classes in the late 19th century by the name of Mensur. Mensur was not about settling a debate. It wasn't even about winning or losing. It was simply about not being a wimp.
It's a duel fought not to kill, but to slash the opponent's face.
Unlike the dueling Frenchmen, there was no fancy footwork involved here. In fact, there was no footwork at all. The ultimate goal was to neither flinch nor dodge, no matter if that razor-sharp steel of your opponent was heading directly for your cheek, forehead, or anywhere else. The only facial protection they wore were strange metal goggles with wire meshes on them to protect their eyes. Monsieur was all about being as stoic as possible and demonstrating your manhood. In fact, if one of the combatants so much as flinched to avoid a strike, then the match was immediately halted and he was branded a coward. It was utterly mental. But if you were brave enough to undergo this torture, you could potentially walk away with the ultimate European status symbol, a schmiss, literally meaning bragging scar.
Ah, this lucky lad is the happy winner of the contest, while his opponent, unmarked, must fight again.
These wounds, once healed into long, jagged marks across the cheeks or forehead, became badges of honor amongst Germany's student elite. In fact, so desirable was the schmiss that some students hired surgeons to make careful incisions on their cheeks if their dueling bouts failed to leave a sufficiently distinguished mark. And some just razored their own faces. Others, as Mark Twain once noted with bemusement, if they only received a small wound, they would mess with it by pulling it apart or pouring red wine into it, so the wound looked uglier when it healed. The mensura was so ingrained in German culture that most of the country's military officers, judges, and politicians bore these scars. Have you ever noticed that an overwhelming number of famous Nazi officers from history seemed to sport Bond villain-esque facial scars? Well, they weren't won on the battlefield, but during mensura matches in their university days. The government ultimately outlawed the practice, but like any good outlaw tradition, mensura went underground, with secret duels taking place in safe houses and remote barns under the watchful eyes of fraternity alumni.
These young men are members of a secret dueling society. They are college students of the new Germany, a Germany of pride and accomplishment, of shame and penance, a nation that made lampshades of human skin.
As mensura demonstrates, by the late 19th century, dueling had kind of gotten out of hand all over Europe. For centuries, it has just been a weird thing that posh people occasionally did when they inevitably got bored. But by the 19th century, everyone was at it, from hot-headed journalists, perturbed politicians, and even bellicose builders. Governments had long tried to stamp out dueling. France outlawed it as early as 1626. Yet, by the late 19th century, Paris was still hosting duels left, right, and centre. In England, dueling had never really been legal, but it was explicitly outlawed in the army in 1844, as military men loved a good duel. Britain saw its last recorded duel in 1852. Ironically, it was between two political exiles from France, so it wasn't really an English duel at all. By now, the increasingly enlightened British public had come to mock dueling as an archaic practice. One satirical newspaper suggested that gentlemen should instead settle their disputes by seeing who could compose the wittiest insult. In other words, they invented the rap battle. Whilst the English had finally come to the conclusion that the pen is indeed mightier than the sword, or pistol, the French were still frequently dueling late into the 19th and even 20th century. Political duels were particularly common. In fact, the last recorded duel in France, and maybe one of the last recorded duels in history, took place in 1967, when Gaston Defferre, the mayor of Marseille, fought rival politician René Ribière, using swords after they had a rather spicy exchange in Parliament. They both walked away from it mostly intact. Ribière suffered a few minor flesh wounds. A television crew even turned up, but for some inexplicable reason, decided to film from inside a bush. Dueling even made it into the 1908 Olympics. Held in London, two participants clad in full protective gear and what appears to be an early prototype for the Apple Vision Pro for a visor, stood 20 meters apart and fired dueling pistols loaded with non-lethal wax bullets. Embarrassingly, the French took the gold medal, despite pistol dueling being a British preoccupation. Although people don't duel to settle their differences anymore, you could argue that the concept of dueling never truly went away. It just moved into the courtrooms. Gentlemen swapped their swords for lawyers, and the common folk swapped their pistols for pub brawls. The desire to uphold one's honour and defend one's rights are very human traits. And whether it be trial by combat, pistols at dawn, or a beer glass over the back of someone's head at 10 PM in a Wetherspoons, humans will always find a way to scrap about our differences. Thanks for watching. Just a quick word to say that I couldn't make these videos without the support of my Patreon members. Consider joining the exclusive 42 Discord community by supporting me on Patreon. It's a great place to discuss my videos with like-minded individuals and myself. The link's in the description, but if you don't want to, or you can't join my Patreon, then please don't worry. A simple like or comment to say thanks would also put a huge smile on my face. Thank you.